In this famous chess game from 1958, Mikhail, the 8th chess world champion, plays a brilliant game where he plays one of the most beautiful queen sacrifices I've ever seen. Now, this game is truly fantastic. Let's jump right into it. His opponent, who is a strong Bulgarian chess player, starts with the move d4. And Mikhail plays an aggressive opening. He plays the King's Indian defense, and this game heats up very quickly. Now, his opponent gets this very strong center in the middle, lots of pawns, and Mikhail allows this because he's going to try to undermine the center with moves like c5 in the future, and he's going to try to break apart the strong center. So he castles, and notice that over the next couple of moves, white tries to develop, and they castle queenside. Now, why does this matter? Because they've castled queenside and Mikhail has castled kingside, this is going to make the game very, very interesting. When players castle on opposite sides of the board, it leads to an aggressive game. Imagine the king was on g1 instead. Well, you can't really throw pawns at your opponent because you weaken your own king. Here, go ahead, throw pawns at your opponent, you're not going to weaken your own king, and that's exactly what happens in the game. Now, Mikhail here can actually play the move b5, but if white takes on c5, this position is pretty okay for white, so instead of playing the move b5 right away, he plays the move queen to a5, setting up some very nasty ideas. One long-term threat of this move is to put pressure on the a2 pawn, so if this knight ever moves, you could probably just take this pawn. So instead of allowing this pawn to be captured perhaps in the future, his opponent moves to b1 to secure this pawn. And in this position, after playing the move b5 and trying to be aggressive, Mikhail gets hit with the move knight to d5. And of course he foresaw this idea, which is truly just incredible. Now, his opponent probably thinks that they're just much better here, because the idea is that his opponent is forcing him to move his queen all the way back to d8. And why would he have to move back to d8? Because this knight has a very strong threat. They're threatening to take the e7 pawn with check, and of course you can't lose a pawn at this level. So what can Tal do about it? Well, one idea would be to trade the queens, and then try to protect this pawn. But unfortunately, this does not really work, because after you try to trade queens, white has the in-between move, knight takes e7 check, hitting the king is forced to move, and then they capture the queen. So your pawn was not protected, you lost it, and now you've traded queens, you're in a losing middle game / endgame. So this is unacceptable. So what can he do? Moving back doesn't make sense because he just moved there and now he has to move back. That's wasting time and giving white an edge. Pause the video here to see if you could find the brilliant move that wins Mikhail the game. Okay, the move, pause it here if you haven't solved it, is the move knight takes d5. Now, the whole point of this idea was that this knight could not be taken, but it actually can be taken. Knight takes d5 works for a brilliant reason. Now, after queen takes queen, there's really no other moves that you can try here. Maybe you can try something, but really the only move that tries to keep an advantage for white is the move queen takes a5, taking the sacrifice, and after knight takes e3, Black has a bishop and a knight for the queen. So black is technically down in material and the computer likes white's position. However, it's not that much in white's favor, and this position as a human is extremely hard to defend. For first thing to notice is that the rook and the pawn is attacked, and so the rook is forced to move and the pawn takes. Now, what I love about this queen sacrifice is that there's no super clear way forward, and when he sacrificed his queen, he knew that this position, there's no clear way to win, but he's going to try to win this position anyways. There's no way he can immediately win back material. This is long-term pressure on his opponent. And so here the best move by his opponent should be to move the queen all the way back to e1 and try to argue that his extra material is fine. Unfortunately, this move is very scary to make, because after a move like c takes d4, this position looks great for black, because the move that his opponent would have to find to keep any advantage was the idea of knight to f4 with the move knight to d3 to blockade this pawn. Now that's pretty hard to see, but even if you do see it, his opponent would still have to understand that this position is fine for white, even though it looks very scary, and this is only one of many lines his opponent would have to calculate. So this is very scary for his opponent, and instead of doing this, when his queen is attacked on the a5 square from the knight, they decide to say screw it and they sacrifice the rook for the knight. And notice that in many lines, this knight is basically untouchable. You can't really play this move because there's lots of tricks with the knight hopping to a3 with check. So really this knight is going to be here and it's a very strong piece of black, so it somewhat makes sense to try to get rid of black's strongest piece. Unfortunately, after takes and takes, this position is very good for black with the b file opening up, and white is in a lot of trouble. Even though the computer thinks it's equal, Mikhail finds a way through. So now the knight moves back. This is another mistake, even though it's a natural move. By moving back a piece close to your king, you're trying to essentially defend yourself. Again, the computer wants some lines where the knight goes to f4 and tries to blockade on this square. However, this is a much more natural move for a human, just trying to keep pieces close to the king and not lose the game. Now what happens is the rook moves to b8, putting pressure. If this pawn ever takes, white is completely screwed because the rook will take and the bishop will team up. So they cannot do that, and instead what they do is they take this pawn with the bishop. Now here, Mikhail Tal immediately punishes them by playing the move knight to b6, hitting the bishop. And here the computer wants a ridiculous move, bishop takes pawn. This is a move that I would never consider in this position, because in the middle of being attacked, the computer is just like, take the free pawn. And this just looks so scary for a human. You know that this pawn's going to fall. It seems like you're wasting time and you really need to defend yourself. So of course they instead move their bishop to the square of b3, trying to stop the rook from seeing the b2 pawn in the future. So here the pawn on d4 is captured, and here the queen drops back. There's a very nasty threat here. If you decide to just make some random move, the bishop is able to sacrifice itself, because after king takes, this is a fork of the king and the queen. The bishop is unable to take because the rook will take the king. So this is a very nasty threat. But of course, white does not do nothing. They decide to move their queen back to d2. And in this position, things get crazy. Now, he moves the bishop back. This is actually a very brilliant idea. Even though it's a quiet move, it makes things very complicated, because you're now threatening to play the move c4, whereas before, if you play the move c4, your bishop would hang, so you can't do that. But this prepares c4 and the move c3, and that's exactly what happens. The knight moves c4, the bishop moves c3. And here, if you try to take with the knight, you're just completely lost with a huge attack against your king. So notice that this pawn, if you try to take with the pawn, like, again, you're just immediately losing. There's an attack on your queen and there's a check. So here, if you were to take with the knight, here the knight hopping here puts tons of pressure on this pawn. You have to move your queen or you'll lose it. Rook takes a check. You force the king to move. And then here, this nice bishop check. You're basically just forcing the king to move. There's a fork with the knight check. And here, wherever the king moves, you're winning the bishop and completely winning the game. Okay, from this position, his opponent does not just immediately fall apart, and instead they play the move queen to d3, which is a decent move considering that almost everything else loses. Now, in this position, Mikhail takes on the b2 square, and at least now this white king has a pawn that's shielding him from this rook check, but this is not going to save it. The knight hops to the center, perhaps trying to stop the bishop from seeing this pawn. The bishop moves, and here all of black's pieces get into the game. Notice that all of Mikhail's pieces work in harmony. The bishop here, the knight hopping in. Whereas what are white's pieces doing? They're just standing here. And even though material is just about equal, this game is almost about to end. The bishop moves here, again trying to stop the rook from getting close to the king, but here, knight to a4. Now, in the game he takes, but if you don't take, you're just going to get hit with tons of tricks like knight to c3 check, so really you kind of have to take this bishop. And after takes, this rook is hit, so either the rook moves or the knight blocks. Now, if you decide to move the rook, it's still game over. There's no way to save this. There's going to be moves such as trying to basically just take the knight here, and if queen takes, then you're just going to have checkmate. So they would have to basically just sacrifice the queen, and this is just, you cannot do this as white. So after the move bishop to a4, what they decide to do is they decide to block with the knight. It's a reasonable move, but now here comes the rook attacking both the queen and the knight. It's protected by the bishop, of course, and here his opponent basically gives up. They just take this pawn on a6. Tal takes the knight, takes, and here the move rook to c8 seals the deal. You're threatening to play the move rook to c1. You're threatening to make another queen. This is unfortunately over. His opponent simply plays the move queen to a3 to end the game quickly. He gives a check, and after takes, the game is over. His opponent resigns, because if you play the move king to a2, of course, he will under-promote to a bishop and checkmate you like this. The bishops, like so. Of course, you could also promote to a queen, but there's no fun in that. Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe for more incredible games like this one.